most important in terms of making sure that our podcast and the way that we delivered our teaching would be for our students in terms of supporting them as learners. So in 2018, 2019, this module, it's called Law, Rights and Context, was proposed, and it was entirely open in terms of what exactly content would be included. So originally it was, this opportunity was capitalized on to include research-led teaching on my part, and also back in that day, the political issues of the time. So in 2018, 2019, that was Brexit. I'm an EU lawyer, and now today, with Sabrina coming on board with on the team, who is a medical lawyer, COVID-19. So we thought that this was a really important part of the module itself, and indeed the module and in the podcast now has encouraged our own foray into socio-legal theory and socio-legal methodology, and importantly critical legal studies, all of which we very much integrate into our own research as an EU lawyer on my side, as a medical lawyer on Sabrina's side, and also our work together. This is very good in terms of encouraging the second thing we thought was really important, which was interdisciplinarity. So obviously back then and today, I suppose, REF and academia itself were really demanding a lot of interdisciplinarity. And as lawyers, we wanted to really include a lot more voices. And so that was something we thought that we could do through the podcast as well. So the module itself, in 2018, 2019, it was a module of 60 students, and it began to grow for various different reasons over the years. And research collaborations also over the years increased. For example, Sabrina and I started to work together a lot more on our research projects. Most notably, we are we're submitting, hopefully, the final draft of an edited collection to Bristol University Press to be coming out next year on Beyond the Virus, interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary international voices on inequalities related to COVID-19. And through this, we realized that it was really important to bring in a lot of diverse voices, which we had already done at the outset in the module through the introduction of guest lecturers. In fact, Sabrina was a guest lecturer on the module before becoming the module leader every year for her expertise on comparative law and her field work in South Africa. So we had people from practice in the law, we had people from academia, and most importantly, it was all experts on areas that I didn't necessarily have expertise in originally. But more importantly, when Sabrina was the guest lecturer and spoke about South Africa, it opened my eyes to internationalization and internationalization elements, also nowadays coined as decolonization of the curriculum. A student in my original group as well from Brazil had noted the kind of more Western slant in terms of the comparative elements in the first year, which I took on board as a constructive piece of feedback to make improvements as the years went on, and shifted more away with Sabrina towards hopefully including other EDI issues and making sure that there were more representative voices for our students. So then when COVID-19 hit in 2019, 2020, we became very aware that the online format was stifling many of our students' voices, but more importantly, the marginalized students' voices in our groups, due to the fact that we had to record lectures and we had to somewhat dictate, telling students how things were, and seminar style discussion, which is what the module was taught as before, with no lectures. The discussion in these seminars were kind of muted because we were forced into recorded lectures, forced into online small group teaching, plus we had an increasingly large cohort. So that brings us to the last bullet point on the slide, the importance of keeping up with a fast-paced digital age and technology. So we took advantage, or we thought to take advantage of the online recording format to indeed become what is now our podcast. And I will hand over to Sabrina to speak a little bit about the ethos behind it.
Thank you. So the philosophy and essence of what we wanted initially really, in fact, translated rather neatly with the project. So the purpose, as Adrienne explained, was, of course, to embrace technology, but it was not just to provide a quick fix for social distancing rules that were imposed during the pandemic. It was really to use an alternative method to convey alternative teaching philosophy. So I've been interested prior to this in untraditional and alternative teaching methods before coming on the module, and I have experience in teaching in rather unconventional environments. I taught in prison facilities in the United States to very diverse cohorts of inmate students. So I learned a lot about diversity in education through these experiences, and how Adrienne and I wanted to bring this type of diversity in our traditional law school classrooms. I should mention that we have a very diverse student body at the City Law School in terms of faith, race, and culture. We have roughly 80% of our cohort from ethnic minority backgrounds, 71% are women. And this is something that we both see as the greatest strength of our law school. So we wanted to find an approach that truly embraced diversity. We wanted to provide an opportunity to sit, listen, and take in the conversation between us and the students, really. So we selected carefully who was to speak on the podcast. And also we wanted a format that reflected the flexibility that could be appreciated for the type of students that we have. We have a lot of students that are part-time working and have caring responsibility. The great majority of them are commuters and they do not live on campus. So we thought it would be very great for them to do their learning in the setting of their choice, just like Adrienne and I really much enjoyed doing our podcast in the setting of our choice. And we thought that they would like this and not see it as a very rigid academic resource. Looking at the literature also on learning methods, we know that it's clear that the student experience in learning is extremely important. And we, of course, did not want to turn this into a pre-recorded lecture. We wanted to really break away from the traditional academic hierarchy and wanted the students to basically sit at the kitchen table with us and have a chat or in tutorial groups more and share some thoughts. So we wanted to leave the formality aside, but that doesn't mean that we wanted not to be rigorous. Rigor was really much something we thought of in the format and how we articulated our themes. Adrienne will speak to that in a moment. We thought that our teaching approach needed to reflect the theme of the module itself, law, rights, and context, to demonstrate the diversity of thought that is very important in law. So we thought the alternative teaching method would foster dialogue and would include underrepresented voices. And the traditional lecture format does not really do that so well. So we encourage students to think the law differently, just like the title of the module encourages, into a wider social context. So this manifested in the way the students engaged with our podcast. Our conversational format spoke to them and they enjoyed hearing experts. We'll talk about the feedback a little later on. And they understood that they didn't need to have an opinion that was necessarily anchored in a very black letter law rhetoric. They could just offer their thoughts in a very informed opinion manner, just like we did on the podcast. So we uncovered untraditional voices, which was very interesting. At first, the students were uncomfortable sharing strong opinions, but they put together very solid arguments in the summative assessment, which reflected their active engagement with the podcast. So on this topic, I just wanted to add that we wanted to promote inclusivity and diversity. That was our main hope. And we wanted to set the tone to potentially inspire other higher education institutions to come on board with a similar project.
So you can all see the various different episodes and the content of the podcast themselves now that you have the general thinking about how we came up with this idea. I won't go through all of them in turn, as you can all listen to them on all your various podcast hosting sites, but just speak to how we decided to fill all the different slots effectively. So we had 8 official lecture slots. 2 were reserved for more skill-based revisions at the end, so 10 in total, but 8 that we used as podcasts that we publicly published as the City Law School's Law and Society podcast. And in choosing the 8 different topics that we decided to go into depth into for our module itself, we carefully crafted each of these to ensure that there was a diversity of voices, as this is something that we found very important, as Sabrina has mentioned, in the ethos and philosophy. These included included thinking about the gender of our guests, thinking about race, thinking about also things like the seniority within the academy and disciplines. We were very lucky to have both our PhD students, who were women of color, to teach on the module and to be the podcast guests to speak about their areas of expertise. So that also meant we were able to cover topics and issues that Sabrina and I were ourselves not expert in, but get a wide variety of as we mentioned, not only voices, but also disciplines in the module. So it was not just strictly black letter law. We made sure that we set up the podcast so that we would ask the same questions to our guests that we then put in the tutorial handouts to ask our students for discussion in our 2-hour tutorials that were fortnightly. So there were 5 of them over the term. The first one was an hour, the rest were 2 hours. The idea of doing so was to reinforce what we wanted them to kind of think about by hearing first the views of somebody who was arguably an expert in that area, and then get them to think whether they agreed, whether they disagreed, what their thoughts were now informed by having listened to this conversation on the podcast first. We also, as good podcast listeners ourselves, set up a structure in the podcast where we ask the same first question to all of our guests. That is what their view of law is. And then we ended it by asking them what they thought the importance of context to the law was, as the module is called Law, Rights and Context. We know that good podcasts all do this to have a nice trend. And effectively, this whole setup made sure that we were attempting to encourage more seminar style discussion, which students had kind of maybe lacked a little bit being on the online format during the pandemic. And we wanted them to encourage them to present their own views in class, and by emulating what we wanted them to do in the podcast, and also almost giving them the answers to the questions already. We actually had 3 PhD students involved in the content of the module. So my PhD student, Sabrina's PhD student, and then a 3rd PhD student who was in the School of Arts and Social Sciences at City in the interdisciplinary area, a center rather. And each of these PhD students were involved in the teaching as well in the module. So again, we were really trying to foster the enhancement of early career researchers and career development. And of course, this ended up with a very lovely array of different things that we wanted to talk about, or we got to talk about on the podcast. But it wasn't without its challenges. So of course, creating a podcast from scratch is not an easy feat. And one of the biggest challenges was, of course, Sabrina and I having to learn a lot about production of the podcast. I produced all the podcasts myself, having done a lot of looking into how this worked, learning the tech. And then, of course, we had some issues with transcripting and students maybe not understanding certain terms or certain people that we might have mentioned, and the format of transcripts, which we will talk about, Sabrina will talk about as part of our next steps. Of course, needing a lot of technical support at the outset was difficult because we did not necessarily have podcast experts in-house, and getting it set up officially on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, which it now is on, was a big learning curve for us, which we have overcome. And of course, things like you never think of, like logo creation, which was very gratefully done by my partner, who's not an expert, but interested in this area. And yeah, these were various things we worked through to get to this stage, but we think that it's actually come out very nicely, which brings us on very nicely to what our students thought as well.
Thanks, Adrienne. So we have been pleasantly surprised by the very positive response we've received from the students. So since it was the first time we did the podcast, or I ever done a podcast really, and we were teaching that way, we thought it would be good to have some informal temperature checks throughout the term. We would ask students during our tutorials generally what they were thinking, and they said they were enjoying the format. So we were quite happy with that already. We received also spontaneous testimonies to send to us by email. I'll let you to read them. They're right on the slides. And this reflected generally more broadly what we have seen in City's formal module evaluation process. It was mentioned that they very much enjoyed the flexibility of the format, and they really enjoyed the conversations that they were feeling part of. They were just not listening in, they felt really included, and they really enjoyed that aspect. But of course, not all feedback is positive. Some students thought it was very difficult for them to understand certain concepts because of the lack of traditional support materials, such as a textbook or slides. We provided them with extensive warning prior to selecting this module. We also provided them with reading materials. We had a good reading list with academic journal articles, but also provided them with short video clips on key concepts, but still they had some difficulty. So we thought it might be still interesting to document this feedback on an audio file for a future project that I will be talking about in a little bit. So we asked some students at LB to talk about how they felt about the module. Here is one of them.
I found learning by podcast extremely innovative and helpful. This is because I essentially found myself very engaged during the podcast episodes, especially because you were not simply reciting the same things from PowerPoint, but it was like I was in the middle of a very informative conversation between academics. And I thought it was amazing that you had guests that were experts in different disciplines and fields, such as geography and gender politics, and not just having lawyers and people that are experts in law, for example. And in short, it was just very helpful to get to grips with the foundations of law and context.
So we've taken note of all of these comments, all of these comments that we've received in different forums, actually, and we look forward to make some adjustments for next year, which brings me very nicely to talk about next steps. So going forward, we want to continue the podcast, of course. We have plans to edit some of the episodes and involve more experts from our networks to make it even more inclusive and diverse. But what is important to us is to make sure that it takes into account the feedback given to us by our students. So we will put together some short handouts to complement each episode or every other episode, which will give them a very tangible support in addition to the transcripts that we have. We're also working on the transcripts themselves. We can speak a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. But we want to provide them essentially with a digest of the most important concepts and topics, and we think that will be very helpful to them. We're also thinking about adding some online quizzes to periodically test their knowledge, so we get a sense of whether or not they are interested or engaged with the podcast, but also that will signal to them whether or not they have a good understanding of the subjects we're presenting to them. So we will make a conscious effort again this year to tell them that if they want to engage in a traditional module, this might not be the right avenue for them. It's about discussion and really engaging with the podcast. But we want, most importantly, to dedicate an episode to student voices, because we want them to provide, to have an opportunity to provide us feedback in a conversation on the podcast, so they get that experience as well. Adrienne and I also are planning on writing an article about the experience of the design, the recording, and the fantastic production work that she's done. And we will gather for that some structured and formal feedback. This is part of the audio file that you have heard. And we potentially will need to involve also directly the students in the writing of this piece on legal education research.
You've been listening to the Law and Society podcast, brought to you by the City Law School at City University of London.
We hope you enjoyed it and look forward to you joining us soon for another episode.
Yes, so it just leaves us to thank you all for listening to our presentation, whether you meant to be in this panel or not. So thanks to everybody who's here. You can connect with us on all of these different social medias, as you can see on the screen, and you can listen to the podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. That was great. There was only one question that I spotted in the chat, which was about transcripts, and I know you also spotted that. So obviously you are providing transcripts. I don't know if there was more information you wanted to provide.
Yeah, we can definitely speak to that. We worked with our fantastic, actually, educational development team lead to help us with the podcast transcripts. So lectures, when they're recorded, they automatically have a caption. So we uploaded it as like an audio file without video, and it had automatic captions. But of course, as with everything, automatic captions are not always very accurate. And it had a transcript, but it was just like a block of text. So students found this quite difficult to kind of sift through. So I think we're going to work a bit closer with Lead next year to hone this in and make it a bit cleaner, because it was something that students did want and looked like they kind of used and liked. But we definitely could improve on that, I would say. Sabrina, do you want to add anything?
Sorry, not really. I think we're also thinking about involving a student to really fine tune it with the timestamp, as you said. So I think that's the essence of it. Is it's a tricky kind of medium also for learning for them, but at the same time they can keyword search, so they really enjoy that. If it was accurate, I think it would be optimal, but it does not replace listening to the podcast, because there is really an element of conversation that is essential. And also, I think it's more lively to listen to the podcast, but it's a useful support, and we're going to complement the transcript with the handout. That's the idea.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience for Sabrina or Adrienne? While people are thinking, I'd like to ask a question. It's a slightly cheeky question, but I'm interested in the assessment for the module. Do you get students to do this themselves at all?
Create a podcast episode. We wouldn't put any student through that very arduous process. So the assessment is a 2,000-word essay on. We give them 2 questions, which are very open-ended. So they're often about general themes, which this year we decided to ask them about whether they thought that context mattered to the law, and they would answer yes or no, and they would give us whatever like examples they would like, and they could apply whatever theories that we taught throughout. So have you seen in the episodes, we talked about race theory and intersectionality and feminist theory, comparative theory, etc. So they could pick whatever. So it's very broad. And it's effectively, what I think of it as is to get them to almost answer like a question that if they were a guest on the podcast, answer that question using whatever they kind of like or decide they're expert in, really. Yeah. Sabrina, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you summed it all very well. I think the idea is exactly to voice their opinion. I think what we really wanted to take away from this experience for them is that, of course, we want them to cite literature. We want them to do research. This is kind of a research-based learning type of module. But we wanted them to have the courage to just put out there an opinion and have an informed opinion, more than having a structured, very black letter law argument that they're used to in other modules. So we wanted them to embrace that flexibility and say, listen, these are very hot topics. They're very controversial topics. Have a go at it. Supporting yourself with literature, supporting yourself with the podcast, but it's okay to have an opinion and, to try to argue the pros and cons. We're very much telling them to play devil's advocate all the time. So we're trying to trigger that critical thinking. They're second-year students, so we want them to get into the habit for their 3rd year.
Thank you. That was a really clear rationale, really, really well articulated. Thank you very much. I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment. Just in case I'm missing anything, if you are waiting to ask a question, feel free to just unmute and jump in. In which case we are pretty much up to the half hour. So thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. And sorry for all the distractions of chat people saying, I'm not sure if I'm in the right place. But it was a really fascinating presentation, and I shall certainly be going and listening to some of the podcasts. So thank you very much. Our next presenter is Tharindu from the University College of Estate Management, who's going to talk to us about enhancing accessibility awareness. And I will mute myself and hand over to you, Tharindu.
Thank you very much. I'm Tharindu. I'm a learning technology researcher and the chair of Online Learning Research Center at University College of Estate Management, or we call it UCEM. Thank you for joining this session today, and I will try to share some of our experience at UCM in enhancing staff accessibility awareness. We at UCM offer online undergraduate, postgraduate, and apprenticeship programs. UCM's core purpose is to provide accessible, relevant, and cost-effective education, enabling students to enhance careers and contribute to a better built environment. Most of our students are part-time and also they're working. We also have a huge percentage of mature students. So our online delivery helps them to engage in education. Disability is not something that only happens to others. If you are a lucky person not to be affected by a disability, think about yourself in 30, 40, or even 50 years in the future. With age, there will be some difficulties in seeing, hearing, etc. Not to mention the possibility of unexpected events in life. We also have to remember that there are hidden or invisible disabilities. By raising awareness of accessibility, we are making the world a better place for everyone. A ramp, an accessibility aid, helps everyone here. In the digital context, captions help everyone too. When the presenter's accent is not familiar, if the presenter is speaking too fast, or if your language knowledge is not that great. Captions can also help in noisy and/or quiet spaces. Now there is a specific legislation that deals with digital accessibility. We have raised accessibility awareness at UCM via a poster campaign and a screensaver campaign. We have conducted workshops, webinars, regular blogs, updates on institutional bulletin, etc. over the years. I will play a section of a video for you now. These were some of the feedback we received in a pre-COVID in-person workshop.
Today's workshop was very, very interesting and gave us a wider insight into the amount of work that goes in the background to develop training material. The blindfold challenge was extremely difficult. With an IT background, I can normally navigate around websites. To do everything via a keyboard and try and percept what the screen was telling me was actually very, very hard.
The session highlighted to me that we need to keep accessibility at the forefront of our minds throughout our platforms. In doing so, we'll be improving the experience for all students.
The session was really interesting. It's really quite challenging to find and navigate a website whilst being blindfolded. By following some simple rules, we can make our material at UCM really accessible so everybody has a chance to learn.
Accessibility is important so that we produce a material that's accessible by all, regardless of disabilities, and that they can get the maximum benefit to hopefully go on and have wonderful careers.
We now have a self-paced course on accessibility awareness for staff. Our accessibility awareness course was created with two specific objectives in mind. First and foremost, to raise accessibility awareness among staff members, and secondly, to be a reference point for the staff members with accessibility queries to come back to. This course is a place of knowledge that you can refer back to. The course is logically ordered into sections. There are 7 milestone badges. These can only be earned by achieving 100% on the section quizzes. To be fair, 3 attempts are allowed at each quiz. After earning all 7 badges, you can submit a reflection of your learning to earn the final Accessibility Awareness badge. This is an opportunity for the learner to think about what they have learned and how they can make a difference by applying what they have learned. As you can see here, these are the badges that has been issued so far. So what is next? If it is not compulsory, would people want to take a CPD course on accessibility awareness? So far, we have had very good response, as you saw in the badge issuance. Especially the new joiners have been keen to follow our course. So what have we learned? Activity on the course increases after workshops or events. Accessibility awareness is a continued journey. You need to keep on drip feeding. Just having a course, doing a campaign, or conducting a workshop once is not enough. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you very much for that. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment in the chat. Does anybody have a question they want to put in response to that presentation? I have a question. I feel like I'm slightly abusing my position here, but I'll take the opportunity to ask another one. Is your work based around any of the existing frameworks, like the Universal Design for Learning framework, or did you kind of come up with a framework that's specific to UCEM?
What we did was we looked at the WCAG guidelines and what we have to adhere to, and then try to make sure that we cover the sections so that everyone is aware of the accessibility regulations and what needed to be adhered to. So looking at those, we came up with this course. So for example, you don't need to go through it in order. You can pick and choose what you want to do. So basically, if you have a question, you can refer to that specific section.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. And I mean, from your video resource, I could see that was obviously training that had taken place before COVID. Was your online course partly a response to the fact that you were no longer able to do that face-to-face development?
That's a great question, Sam. Actually, that was what happened is we have been running these workshops in person, and we had great response. And the activities were so popular, and every time we put a workshop out, it would be fully booked. But when everything happened, we wanted to do something similar, but offer it online. So then we moved on to having online workshops, as well as creating a course which we thought would be useful as a resource that's there, like the GDPR resources that people can refer back to, because it's all well and good learning things, but you forget. And when you forget, there needs to be somewhere that you can find the information easily and quickly.
Of course, yeah. Okay, we've got a very, very quiet audience today. I think it must be something to do with the fact. Oh no, we have a question from Hannah. So do you have any feedback from students on whether they are reporting finding their learning more accessible?
Thank you. That's a great question. What we have heard from the staff is that they are looking into, when they are looking into creating new modules, they are thinking about accessibility. So this is slightly different to your direct question, but what I have heard is, so for example, our graphics designer sent me an email the other day highlighting a line from one of her emails that she had received. So when somebody is creating a resource, they are asking, can you please make sure that this is accessible? So what she wanted to highlight is the fact that people are thinking about making things accessible even before starting producing the materials. So, which is a really good thing, because that's what we want to have. Unfortunately, I don't have direct responses from students at the moment, but we are running a student panel. So this is one question that we are hoping to pose to our students.
That's great, thank you. And there's another question here from Christine, who says, you mentioned the use of screensavers in your campaign, and could you say a little bit more about how you use those?
What we did was, it was the time that we had this transform project where we were redesigning some of our modules, well, almost all of our modules. So at that point, we felt that we needed something that would remind people all the time what is important, and that the accessibility is something that you can't just plug in at the end, that you need to be thinking about it when you were going to design something. So we did a accessibility poster using Creative Commons licensed poster. So we changed it for our need, and we displayed it all around the building and in meeting rooms, etc. And then we took three at a time, three messages, and then created a series of screensavers. I was very lucky because our graphics designer was in with me in this project. So she did everything beautifully. So what we did was we ran this campaign for a month, where we had a series of screensavers which were rolled out into the whole of the institution. So if you were not working for like a couple of minutes on this computer, you would see it coming. And whenever you were walking past other people's screens, then you would see that coming up if the person is not there, etc. So we think that it was very useful. And it also helped that we did the poster campaign first, then did the screensaver campaign. So people saw the poster, and some in the poster there were lots of items, and at a time 3 of them were highlighted in the screensaver campaign.
Great, thank you very much. I'm not seeing any more questions, and I think we should probably move on to our last presentation. But thank you very much. That was really good. And our last presentation in this session is from Jenny, who is going to talk to us about compassion and boundaries in supporting students at a distance. Jenny is also from City University.
I am, thank you, Sam. It's good to see everyone. Let me just share my screen and share with you some emerging thoughts. It's really great to be back here at RIDE. As Sam said, my name is Jenny Fogarty, and I'm a senior lecturer in education at City University. Unfortunately, I have not been as well prepared as my other colleagues with my on-brand City Pride background, which is absolutely my fault. So I will update that later. But it is really good to be here back at RIDE, part of the Centre for Distance Education, or the new Centre for Online Distance Education. Before I joined City, I used to come to RIDE in person because I had many happy years at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and it's lovely to see colleagues in the space. So even if you were coming along to hear parallel session A, hopefully we have something to think about now as part of this last session. And it is a lightning session, so it's a very short session that I've got with you to think about some emerging thoughts and ideas around research into compassion and boundaries. So I have taught for many years. Many of you know that I was a teacher by trade. I was a deputy head in school before I moved into teacher training and then academic development. I've taught online, I've taught face-to-face, I've taught in prison, kind of the ultimate low-tech environment, and then taught totally online. And I was part of the team that worked on the COVID-19 MOOC at the London School of Hygiene as well. So lots of different experiences, but I wanted to ask you to contribute during this lightning talk in the chat, because we haven't got a lot of time this afternoon. And some of the things you might agree with, some of the things you might absolutely disagree with, but I'm asking you to do a bit of reflecting on the last couple of years along with me, thinking about your own experiences supporting students and how that might have changed over the last couple of years, particularly thinking about how we support our students at a distance. So some of the questions that have been troubling me, making me think, are to what extent have boundaries in education changed during the pandemic? How do we as teachers in higher education demonstrate compassion to our students? And how do we create and support the conditions for compassion in the post-pandemic university? So as you can see, I'm starting with these two key words around compassion and boundaries, and I'm making some assumptions here. I'm making the assumption that compassion is a good thing, that compassion is an important part of what it means to be a teacher in higher education, and that it should be something that we see more of. And there's an emerging body of literature now that started to develop pre-pandemic around the compassion at university. And our colleagues at the University of Arts London are doing some amazing stuff around compassionate assessment, which I would urge you to look at if this is something that interests you. But what do we mean by compassion? So compassion is more than just being nice to students. I think it's a given that we want students to have good, positive relationships with us. I was at the Wong KHE briefing this morning around belonging and inclusion. But it's more than that. Compassion is about a consciousness of distress and that desire to alleviate distress, both for ourselves and for others. So there's that notable input there around ourselves, this idea of being a compassionate teacher in higher education, noticing our own sense of overwhelm, our own sense of burnout, our own sense of giving too much to our students. And this is particularly important when we think about that student support role that we play, whether that is through formal personal tutoring, whether it's through a specific role that you might have supporting students, or whether that is through your interactions that you have with students on modules that you teach. And it's this idea of being active in the space rather than passive. So it's not about just platitudes and being nice and responding to emails. It's about actually doing something. And then on the flip side of that, we've got the idea of boundaries. So there's some really interesting literature that talks to us about how we can be more compassionate to students and to ourselves if we have clearer boundaries. And that's where I really started with this process when I was thinking about the role that boundaries play in teaching. So at the micro level, we're talking about our interactions with students, where we draw the line in terms of how much we give, in terms of our time and ourselves. But one of the challenges that we have, particularly in distance education, is that these are often assumed and not articulated. So I used to do a lot of work with colleagues in delivering distance education at the London School of Hygiene, and we talk about this idea of boundaries and expectations, and how people would say, well, they should just know, they're master's level students, they should just know to ask for help. They should just know that we're here to help them. Okay, but have we actually articulated what support is available and how those support mechanisms can be used to maximise student success? So the rules of professional relationships are often unclear. So we talk about the word personal tutor and pastoral tutor, but we don't really unpack what that word personal means. So for some students, particularly students where English isn't their first language, that can be hugely problematic because the word personal has certain connotations to it. And it includes, but it's not limited to, the idea of availability, how much personal information we share, how much intimacy we have with students, and actually how much support we give. And how one of the challenges comes when we try to put in boundaries after we've established that relationship with students rather than at the beginning. So I'm making some assumptions here. I'm making the assumption that boundaries are good, that we need boundaries to work in a healthy way, that we need boundaries to live in a healthy way, and that compassion is a good thing. And again, you might not agree with me, so I would love to hear that in the chat or in the questions as I finish up in a few moments. So I just wanted to share with you some of the literature around teaching as a compassionate act, because that's something that has resonated really strongly with me through my experiences, particularly working with people in non-traditional education settings. So this idea that teaching and compassion are the relationship between equals. moving us away from the sage on the stage, the knowledgeable person who stands up in front of students and has all the answers, to that co-created learning relationship. And we see that through the work of Paulo Freire, critical pedagogy, that dialogue is used and education is the practice of freedom. And that underpinned a lot of my work that I used to do teaching in prison. This idea that compassion is a means to demonstrate humanity in the workplace as professionals. And is that at odds, that demonstration of humanity, with putting in boundaries? And then now Noddings writes a lot about caring as a mark of personhood. It is what it means to be human, is that we care. And do we often shut that down when we're trying to be professionals? And we're picking up lots of threads here that we could think about in terms of imposter syndrome, what a proper academic is, what students expect the prof to be, lots of things that we can think about in more detail, but not necessarily today. So just starting to pose some of these questions for your reflection. So what did we see during the pandemic? And this is some anecdotal feedback that's been taken through my own experiences, the experience of colleagues, the experience of sharing some of these reflections with others, but also I teach on a master's in academic practice, and we have a student support and personal tutoring module. And this was something that our colleagues at City University told us. So this idea that the expectation for support massively increased, that we had to do much more during COVID-19. Was that your experience? The idea of it being an always-on working culture, those first 6 months particularly being incessant Zoom calls all day, constant meetings checking in, are we doing everything right? This idea that students got an insight into home life and family pressures and your personal identity in different ways. That we worked in professionally in unsuitable settings. We might have been used previously to students Zooming in or Skyping in from their bedroom, but they weren't used to us Skyping in from our dining room or from the back of our living room or from our bedroom. And how does that change our professional identity? The use of different technologies without clear expectation setting. So WhatsApp is a great example of that, moving straight into these very accessible means of communication without setting the expectation for how they're used. Feeling the need to respond outside of our expertise and experience because students were coming to us with so many questions and queries at a time of crisis, not just for them, not just for us, but for the whole world, and feeling like we couldn't say no. And then working in this crisis management way, this kind of responding with urgency that then became the norm. And I often used to say to colleagues, it's not that you're not responding quick enough to students, it's that you're responding too quickly. And that leads you down a path of all sorts of unintended consequences. But we've seen this feedback for students, but how far does it resonate, or is it heightened for our students who study at a distance? So did this create a shared experience? So students became a collective group across the world experiencing common issues. I remember sitting in meetings with colleagues that used to work internationally who said, now you know what it's like for us. We've been dealing with this for years with the Skype or the Adobe Connect not working properly. Now you know what it's like. And there's this kind of shared understanding that students, there were no such thing really as distance students because they were all working at a distance. We were all working remotely. So that changed our kind of professional identity and their student identity and how we impacted on them. So we know things have changed. We know we're still working in a sense of crisis. And that for some of us is very difficult. We're kind of limping towards the summer, reflecting on a second academic year with a huge amount of upheaval. What does that mean for us? So I was struck with Ali's keynote earlier talking about the non-return to normal. So what's this going to mean for us in terms of student support? Are we going to reset the agenda? Should we? Are these insights into our lives and our backgrounds, is that a good thing? What aspects will we retain and how do we keep the right balance? So if we've opened up this world for our students, do we shut it back down again? And at what cost has it been to us? So I'd be really interested if anyone wants to share in the chat. I'm conscious of time, Sam, I am finishing up. Any of their own experiences around student support and what this has taken, the toll it's taken on us, or whether actually it's been transformational and we've seen lots of positive changes through the breaking down, particularly of technological barriers that we've seen in the last 2 years. So really keen to hear people's experiences as I develop this emerging research, and want to talk to more people about what their experiences were. We've particularly seen it for colleagues who are working with students on vocational courses, teaching, nursing, medicine, that there was a huge change in boundaries and expectations in terms of compassion during the pandemic. So you might have similar or different experiences. A few references for you there, but really encouraging people to get in touch and keep connecting with me, and lovely to see so many people. I'm going to stop sharing now so that if anyone does want to come on or put their hand up or come in, hopefully Sam, that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's great. That was, you covered a lot of ground in a few minutes, and I suspect I'm going to end up having to cut us off in order for people to get to the next keynote. But first 2 hands to go up. Sabrina.
Hi, Sabrina.
Hi, Jenny. It was an absolutely fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it thoroughly. It was so interesting and really food for thought. But I thought, and I don't know if this is not what you want to look at, or this is not an appropriate question, but I was thinking that this compassion that we're meant to have towards students, and I found it very interesting whether or not it's a positive thing, or what we understand as compassion, and this relation of equal that you're talking about, especially with regards to inmate student. What about us? I wanted to say, what compassion do we have towards the instructor, if we want to label it kind of more neutrally? What is student compassion towards us has been during this time? And are we were in a position of authority before, and maybe there was an imbalance prior to the pandemic. Now I believe that they are in the position of having greater authority towards us, because we're left grappling with this technology. I found personal tutoring extremely challenging during those times. I still do, because of the hybrid method. It's really difficult to actually engage with the students. Sometimes they just don't show up to the office hour, although they signed up. So there's kind of this blank screen dynamic going on. So I don't know if you wanted to share.
No, absolutely. And I think that's where the boundaries part comes in for me. So that's where it's not just about the constant giving all the time under the guise of compassion. Well, that's what compassion is, because it just means going above and beyond for students. You know, we hear that constantly, this refrain of going above and beyond. And I can see Diana's put that in the chat, this idea about it being compassion for staff. And that's why I like the language of compassion, Sabrina, because it's not just about like do-gooding. It's about actually noticing yourself as well as noticing your students. And I think the challenge comes because the boundaries keep changing. And every time we set a relationship with students that feels secure and solid, the rules change again. And often we have very little control about how those rules are changing. And so we have to continually reset the whole time. And that is challenging. That's challenging for us, and it's challenging for them, because the goalposts are shifting. And I think we've created an environment where, you know, it's that kind of neoliberal education. They're consumers, they've paid a lot, they're going through a lot. And I think we need to get better at working with our students, not just in induction, but all the way through, about how we work well together, how we create a learning community, and how there are peaks and troughs for you and there are peaks and troughs for us. And actually it's that mutual respect that we've got to work on. And I think we need to get better at articulating it, because students get it. When you explain it to them, they do get it. But we've already seen, if you look at the absolutely, you know, bogus literature around evaluation, we already saw comments from students saying things like, well, you know, I don't pay $9,000 a year to listen to my tutor lecture with a baby on their lap. You know, where's the compassion there for their student, their lecturers? So I think it's about that two-way street for me, and it's not about putting in more barriers for us or more things to do, because now we've got to be compassionate. It's about how do we want to live, and how do we want to work, and how do we want to do that well.
Jenny, you've opened up a whole bunch of issues. I think we could probably stay here and talk about it for the next hour. There's a couple of questions in the chat that you might want to get back to people afterwards with, but I'm going to let Adrienne ask the last question or make the last comment.
Yeah, very quickly, I have a comment and a question. So the question is, in your experience, to what extent do you think that the industry, as it were, has actually been going towards more and more compassion, or like students more being encouraged to tell us their stories and to offload onto us? Because I think that over the years, this has actually been the trend, and the pandemic has only heightened that. So I wondered if that was your experience. And then my comment, it was just that something that really struck me was when you said we actually have to answer less quickly because of the technology kind of digital age, and how texting is actually more common. So you reply an email quickly, they'll reply an email quickly as if they're texting you, no, like, dear X, sincerely this person. It becomes like that kind of conversation. So I just thought that was really interesting, and definitely an experience that I've had, and I found it really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you, Adrienne. And I think it's all there for the taking, right? So I think you're probably right that it was there pre-pandemic in this kind of, you know, bulging, almost obese student services that we have now, where things are just grow and grow, and there's more demand, and this group of students and that group of students. But students still come to their personal tutor. They can't navigate that space in the way that we think they can. So they still come to that single point of contact. And we feel a kind of urge to support. That's what many of us got into teaching because we love working with students. We don't want them to have difficulties. We don't want them to struggle. We want to help them. But I think it is about how we address that. That it's all about balance for me. Absolutely. It's all about balance. And the balance is off. It's definitely off, and we need to start to redress that balance so that we can create healthy workplaces for students and for staff to thrive and learn together without feeling like, oh my goodness, I'm racing towards August so that I can collapse, because that's not why we will want to work in the academy. We want to work in the academy because we love research and we love students and we love higher education. So that's what I'm passionate about. Do keep talking to me if you want to continue the conversation, but we have got the next session, Sam, so I won't take up any more time.
Yes, sorry to cut it short, but we have got the final keynote of today to get to. I think this is a really rich topic, and I think it's something we might suggest as one of our 1 hour sessions where we can give these kind of discussions a bit more space, because I think there was lots more that
I was too scared to do it for a longer session, Sam. That's why I only put myself in for a lightning. So there you go.
You've tried it, you've flown that kite, and now you'll have to come back and do a longer one. Right. But thank you to all the presenters this afternoon, and I will let you all go so that you can get to the final plenary session. But thank you again, and see you later.